This epic Western that united Hollywood's biggest stars hides some of the most bizarre production secrets in film history. From a catastrophic stunt accident that nearly killed a man to an 800-pound camera that terrorized actors, this Cinerama spectacular created as many off-screen dramas as it did on-screen adventures. Costumes had to be hand-sewn to fool ultra-sharp cameras, a major star's death changed everything, and an entire love story vanished into thin air. Here are the 15 weird facts you didn't know about how the West was won. Fact 1. The 800-pound camera monster. When actors signed up for How the West Was Won in 1962, they probably expected to deal with the usual challenges of making a Western movie, like dust, heat, and maybe a few temperamental horses. What they didn't expect was coming face to face with what might have been the most intimidating piece of equipment in Hollywood history, an 800-pound camera that looked more like a piece of industrial machinery than a filmmaking tool. The Cinerama camera system was essentially 3 cameras built into one massive unit, designed to capture the ultra-wide panoramic shots that made Cinerama famous. But when the filmmakers added the sound blimp, a protective housing to muffle the camera's noise during filming, the entire contraption became a monster that weighed more than 4 average-sized men combined. Moving this beast around movie sets required careful planning and plenty of muscle power. The real nightmare began when directors needed close-up shots of the actors. Because of the Cinerama system's 27mm lenses, getting anything resembling a normal waist-up shot meant positioning the camera incredibly close to the subject. We're talking about just 2 to 3 feet from the actor's face. But with that massive sound blimp surrounding the camera, the actual distance shrunk to a terrifying 18 inches between the actor and the camera's transparent plastic bubble. Imagine trying to deliver an emotional performance with an 800-pound mechanical monster breathing down your neck, literally close enough to fog up with your breath. Many seasoned Hollywood actors found this experience so unnerving that they completely changed their acting style, abandoning the subtle techniques that worked for regular movie cameras and instead adopting the more exaggerated, theatrical approach they'd use on stage. The intimidation factor was so intense that some performers later admitted the camera itself became a character they had to work around, transforming what should have been intimate, dramatic moments into battles against both their lines and their own anxiety about the looming mechanical beast just inches from their faces. Fact 2. Gary Cooper's tragic last role. In February of 1961, Hollywood trade papers announced that Gary Cooper would be joining the star-studded cast of How the West Was Won, taking on the role of Linus Rawlings, a rugged mountain man who becomes the patriarch of the pioneering Prescott family. For fans of Western movies, this was exciting news since Cooper had been one of the genre's biggest stars for decades, from his early breakthrough in The Virginian back in 1929 all the way through classics like High Noon. But within just a few days of that casting announcement, everything changed in the most heartbreaking way possible. Cooper, who was 60 years old at the time, had been privately battling cancer, and his condition took a sudden turn for the worse. The newspapers that had just celebrated his involvement in the epic Western were now reporting that the beloved actor was dying, and it became clear that he would never make it to the film's scheduled start date in May of 1961. Gary Cooper passed away on May 13, 1961, just 1 week after his 60th birthday and mere days before How the West Was Won was supposed to begin filming. His death sent shockwaves through Hollywood, but it also left the filmmakers scrambling to find a replacement for such a crucial role. That's when James Stewart stepped in to take over the part, but the transition created its own set of problems. Stewart was 53 years old when he accepted the role, but the character of Linus Rawlings was supposed to be only 28 in the story. Despite being one of Hollywood's most accomplished actors and a veteran of many Western films, Stewart openly admitted that he felt completely miscast in the role that had been designed specifically for Cooper's particular screen presence and acting style. The age difference between Stewart and his character became so obvious on screen that it created a strange disconnect that eagle-eyed viewers still notice today, making this casting change one of the film's most visible behind-the-scenes compromises. Fact 3. Hope Lange's vanished love story. Hope Lange was cast in what should have been one of the most important female roles in How the West Was Won, playing Julie Stewart, the daughter of Henry Fonda's character, and the love interest for George Pepper's Zeb Rawlings. Lange actually filmed extensive scenes for the movie, creating a complex romantic storyline that was meant to span multiple segments of the epic film and help tie the generations of the Prescott family together. According to the original script and the Louis L'Amour novelization that was based on the screenplay, Julie Stewart was supposed to be a significant character who worked as a showgirl in the railroad camp where Zeb meets her. The story followed their courtship, marriage, and life together as the railroad pushed westward across America. Lange's character was intended to bridge the gap between the earlier segments featuring Henry Fonda as her father and the later parts of the film, making her role crucial to the movie's overall narrative structure. But there was one major problem with Julie's storyline that the studio executives couldn't stomach in 1962. The script called for Julie to eventually divorce Zeb after their marriage fell apart, and she would abandon him to pursue other opportunities. This plot point created a serious conflict with the studio's vision of how the West was won as a wholesome family film that would appeal to audiences of all ages during the holiday season. The major studio heads at MGM decided that showing a divorce and a woman abandoning her husband was completely unacceptable for a movie they were marketing as family entertainment. Rather than rewrite Lange's storyline to make it more palatable, they made the drastic decision to cut her character entirely from the final film. All of her scenes ended up on the cutting room floor, and her role as Julie Stewart was later given to Carolyn Jones, who appears only in the final segment as Zeb's wife with no explanation of how they met or married, leaving a noticeable gap in the story that confused many viewers. Fact 4. The stuntman's devastating accident. Bob Morgan was a veteran Hollywood stuntman who had worked on dozens of films throughout his career, but nothing could have prepared him for what happened during the filming of How the West Was Won's climactic train robbery sequence. Morgan, who was married to actress Yvonne DiCarlo, famous for playing Lily Munster on the hit television show The Munsters, was doubling for George Peppard in a gunfight scene that took place on a moving railroad flat car loaded with heavy fiberglass logs. The scene was designed to be one of the film's most exciting action sequences, with Morgan and other stuntmen playing train robbers engaged in a shootout with law enforcement officers while the train barreled down the tracks. Morgan had successfully completed his shots for the scene and was taking a break, crouching beside a pile of logs on the flat car to rest between takes. The logs were secured to the train car with heavy chains, which should have kept them safely in place during the entire sequence. But during a break in filming, disaster struck when the chains holding the logs suddenly snapped without warning. The heavy fiberglass logs shifted and tumbled, crushing Morgan as he crouched beside them and knocking him off the flat car onto the railroad tracks below. The accident was so severe that the train's axles rolled over him, but Morgan managed to summon enough strength to push the train truck bodily off the rails, likely saving his own life in the process. The injuries Morgan sustained were catastrophic and life-changing. He lost his leg in the accident, suffered damage to bones in his spine, and his face was severely disfigured from the trauma. The recovery process was long and grueling, taking him a full 5 years to heal, to the point where he could move by himself and walk unaided again. During this entire period, his wife Yvonne DiCarlo made the difficult decision to put her own successful acting career on hold, so she could stay home and nurse her husband back to health, demonstrating remarkable dedication during one of the most challenging periods of their marriage. Fact 5. Hand-sewn costumes for sharp eyes. The costume department for How the West Was Won faced a challenge that no other movie production had ever encountered before, and it all came down to the incredible detail that the Cinerama camera system could capture and display. While most Hollywood films of the early 1960s could get away with costumes that looked good enough for regular movie screens, Cinerama's ultra-wide format and massive curved theater screens meant that every single stitch, seam, and fabric detail would be magnified and scrutinized like never before. The problem was that standard movie costume construction relied heavily on sewing machines to create the clothing worn by actors, which was perfectly fine for normal film production where audiences sat far enough away that machine stitching looked natural and convincing. But when those same costumes were projected onto Cinerama's enormous screens, which could be several stories tall and completely surround the audience's field of vision, machine stitching suddenly became glaringly obvious and artificial-looking. The costume designers quickly realized that machine-made stitches created perfectly uniform, repetitive patterns that would immediately scream fake to audiences watching on the giant Cinerama screens. Moviegoers would be able to see every individual stitch with crystal clarity, and the mechanical precision of sewing machine work would destroy the illusion that these characters were wearing authentic 19th-century clothing that had been made by hand in frontier conditions. This discovery forced the entire costume department to abandon their usual production methods and instead hand-sew every single piece of clothing worn by the actors throughout the film. Seamstresses and tailors had to stitch each garment by hand using traditional techniques, creating the slightly irregular, imperfect stitching patterns that would actually look authentic when magnified on the massive Cinerama screens. This painstaking process took significantly longer than machine sewing and required much more skilled labor, but it was the only way to maintain the realistic appearance that the filmmakers needed for their epic western to look convincing to audiences experiencing it in the revolutionary Cinerama format. Fact 6. 4 Oscar-winning cinematographers required. Most Hollywood movies get by with just one director of photography to handle all the camera work. But How the West Was Won was so technically challenging and geographically ambitious that the filmmakers had to hire not 1, not 2, but 4 separate cinematographers to get the job done. What makes this even more remarkable is that all 4 of these camera experts were Academy Award winners, representing some of the most talented and experienced professionals in the entire film industry. The 4 cinematographers chosen for this massive undertaking were William H. Daniels, who had been Greta Garbo's personal cameraman and won an Oscar for his work, Milton R. Krasner, known for classics like The Setup and All About Eve, Charles Lang, who had shot films like The Big Heat and The Magnificent Seven, and Joseph Lachelle, who had worked extensively with directors Otto Preminger and Billy Wilder. The producers specifically selected these men because they had already proven their skills by winning Academy Awards for their previous work, and the studio knew they would need that level of expertise to handle the revolutionary Cinerama system. The reason for needing so many top-tier cinematographers came down to the sheer scope and complexity of the production. How the West Was Won was being filmed across multiple states to capture the authentic landscapes of the American frontier, from the Ohio River in Illinois to Monument Valley on the Arizona-Utah border, plus locations in Colorado, South Dakota, California, and Nevada. Each cinematographer was assigned to handle different segments of the film and different geographical locations, allowing the production to shoot simultaneously in various places and speed up the overall filming process. But the technical challenges of Cinerama made their job incredibly difficult. The 3-camera system pointed in different directions, which meant lighting a scene required perfect coordination between backlight, crosslight, and flat light to achieve uniform illumination across the entire 146-degree field of view. The cinematographers had to master completely new techniques for this format, and even with their combined expertise and Oscar-winning credentials, they all received Academy Award nominations for their groundbreaking work on this film. Fact 7. Actors couldn't make eye contact. One of the strangest technical problems that plagued How the West Was Won had to do with something as basic as 2 people looking at each other during a conversation, which should be the most natural thing in the world for professional actors. But the Cinerama camera system's 3-lens design created a bizarre situation where actors had to be positioned in completely unnatural ways that made normal eye contact impossible during filming. The 3 cameras that made up the Cinerama system were angled differently from each other to capture the ultra-wide 146-degree field of view, and this meant that when 2 actors stood facing each other in what seemed like a normal conversation setup, the cameras would actually record them from slightly different perspectives. The actors had to be artificially positioned out of their natural dramatic and emotional positions, standing awkwardly apart and often looking in directions that felt completely wrong for the scene they were trying to perform. During filming, this created enormous challenges for the performers because they had to ignore their instincts about how to interact with their scene partners and instead follow very specific positioning instructions that felt artificial and disconnected. Karl Malden, who appeared in the film, later recalled that this was an especially difficult adjustment for actors who didn't have much stage experience, since theater work sometimes requires similar kinds of artificial positioning that film actors aren't used to. The real problem became apparent when the film was shown outside of specially equipped Cinerama theaters. The 3-camera system was designed so that when the 3 separate film strips were projected simultaneously onto the massive curved Cinerama screen, the actors' positions and sight lines would magically synchronize and look natural. But when How the West Was Won was shown on regular flat screens or on television, this synchronization was completely lost. Audiences watching the film in these formats would notice that during supposedly intimate conversations between characters, the actors appeared to be looking past each other or staring off into space, never actually making proper eye contact throughout their entire dialogue scenes. Fact 8. John Ford's vanishing director problem. John Ford was one of Hollywood's most legendary directors, famous for classics like The Searchers and The Man Who Shot Liberty Valance, but he had a very particular habit that created a unique problem during the filming of How the West Was Won. Ford always insisted on sitting right beside the camera while it was rolling, so he could watch the action unfold with intense focus, studying every detail of his actors' performances and making sure each shot captured exactly what he had envisioned. This directing style had worked perfectly throughout Ford's long and successful career when he was using standard single-lens cameras, but the massive Cinerama system presented an entirely new challenge that nobody had anticipated. The Cinerama camera was so much larger than regular movie cameras, and its three-lens design captured such an incredibly wide field of view that Ford's usual spot right next to the camera put him directly in the frame of the shot. The problem became apparent almost immediately when the film crew started reviewing the footage from Ford's Civil War segment of the movie. There, clear as day in scene after scene, was the famous director himself sitting in his director's chair, completely visible to the camera and ruining take after take of what should have been dramatic battle sequences and intimate character moments set during the 1860s. Cinematographer Joseph Lachelle quickly realized that they needed to come up with a creative solution to accommodate Ford's ingrained working habits without constantly having the director accidentally photobomb his own movie. Lachelle designed and built a special elevated rig that allowed Ford to maintain his preferred position of being as close as possible to the camera action, but positioned him high above the massive Cinerama camera instead of beside it. This custom-built director's perch kept Ford out of the camera's ultra-wide field of view, while still allowing him to maintain the hands-on directing style that had made him one of the most respected filmmakers in Hollywood history. Fact 9. The recycled Mexican Army. John Wayne had a clever solution when the filmmakers of How the West Was Won needed footage of Mexican soldiers for their epic Western, and it involved recycling material from one of his own previous movies, in a way that probably saved the production both time and money. Wayne, who appeared in the film as General William Tecumseh Sherman, provided the producers with actual footage of Mexican Army soldiers that had been filmed for his 1960 epic The Alamo, where he had served as both director and star. The Alamo had been Wayne's passion project, a film he had spent years developing and financing himself to tell the story of the famous 1836 battle in Texas, where Davy Crockett, Jim Bowie, and William Travis made their legendary last stand against the Mexican army led by General Santa Anna. Wayne had invested enormous amounts of his own money into making the Alamo as authentic and spectacular as possible, which included hiring hundreds of extras to portray Mexican soldiers and filming elaborate battle sequences with period-accurate costumes and equipment. When How the West Was Won needed footage of Mexican troops for their own historical sequences, Wayne apparently saw an opportunity to give his expensive Alamo footage a second life while helping out his fellow filmmakers. Rather than force the How the West Was Won production to hire their own extras, build their own Mexican army costumes, and film entirely new sequences of soldiers marching and drilling, Wayne simply provided them with the high-quality footage he had already shot for the Alamo just 2 years earlier. This creative recycling meant that audiences watching How the West Was Won were actually seeing the same Mexican soldiers that had appeared in the Alamo, though most viewers probably never noticed, since the footage was used as background material rather than featuring any recognizable close-ups of specific actors. It was an early example of what would now be called stock footage sharing between productions, and it demonstrated Wayne's practical approach to filmmaking and his willingness to help other directors solve their production challenges using resources that already existed. Fact 10. James Stewart's bizarre death double. James Stewart's character Linus Rawlings dies during the Civil War segment of How the West Was Won. And when it came time to film the scene where his body is identified by army surgeons, Stewart came up with what seemed like a perfectly logical solution to a common movie-making problem. He volunteered to play his own corpse, lying still on the examination table while other actors delivered their lines around his supposedly lifeless body. This kind of thing happens all the time in Hollywood, where actors often portray their own characters' dead bodies rather than hiring doubles for what should be a simple scene requiring no movement or dialogue. Stewart was a consummate professional who had been making movies for decades, so playing dead for a few minutes while the cameras rolled would have been no big deal for an actor of his experience and skill level. But director John Ford, who was handling the Civil War segment of the film, rejected Stewart's offer for reasons that remain unclear to this day. Instead of letting Stewart lie motionless on the table as his own corpse, Ford insisted on using a body double to represent the deceased Linus Rawlings during the identification scene where army doctors examined the fallen soldier's body. The problem was that Ford's choice of body double created one of the most glaring continuity errors in the entire film. Throughout the movie, Stewart's Linus Rawlings is clearly shown to have gray hair, which matches Stewart's own appearance during filming. But when audiences see the supposed corpse of Linus Rawlings being examined by the Civil War surgeons, the dead body has bright red hair that looks nothing like Stewart's character. This obvious mismatch became immediately apparent to anyone paying attention during the scene, creating a jarring moment that pulled viewers out of the story and made them wonder if they were even looking at the same character. The red-haired corpse bore no resemblance whatsoever to the gray-haired mountain man that Stewart had been portraying throughout the earlier segments of the film, making Ford's decision to refuse Stewart's simple offer one of the most puzzling and counterproductive choices in the entire production. Fact 11. George Peppard's forbidden voice impression. During filming of How the West Was Won, George Peppard found himself in an awkward situation that highlighted one of the biggest challenges of making such a sprawling, multi-generational epic story. Peppard played Zeb Rawlings, the son of James Stewart's character Linus Rawlings, but the two actors never actually appeared in any scenes together, because the story jumped forward in time between different segments of the film. This created a potential problem for audiences who might have trouble keeping track of which characters were related to each other across the movie's 50-year timeline, especially since the film featured so many different actors playing various members of the Prescott and Rawlings families. When Peppard's character had a scene where he was supposed to reminisce about his late father and tell stories about the old mountain man's adventures, Peppard worried that viewers might not remember or understand that he was talking about Stewart's character from the earlier segments. So during filming of this reminiscence scene, Peppard decided to improvise by doing an imitation of James Stewart's distinctive voice and speaking style while telling the story about his father. Peppard figured that if he could capture some of Stewart's vocal mannerisms, it would help remind the audience that Zeb was indeed the son of the character they had seen Stewart portray earlier in the film. But director John Ford was not amused by this creative improvisation and immediately stopped filming to reprimand Peppard for going off script. Ford apparently felt that the voice impression was unprofessional or inappropriate, and he ordered Peppard to stick to his own natural voice and delivery for the scene. However, Peppard stood his ground and actually argued back with the legendary director, which took considerable courage given Ford's reputation for being tough and uncompromising on set. Peppard explained his reasoning, insisting that the voice imitation was important because it would help audiences remember which character his father was supposed to be in such a long and complex story. Ford eventually accepted Peppard's argument, and the voice impression stayed in the final film. Fact 12. The terrifying 18-inch close-ups. The Cinerama camera system created one of the most psychologically challenging filming environments that Hollywood actors had ever encountered, and it all came down to how uncomfortably close they had to get to the enormous camera equipment whenever directors needed close-up shots. Because of the Cinerama system's 27mm lenses and the way the three-camera setup was designed, getting anything that resembled a normal waist-up shot of an actor required positioning them just 18 inches away from the camera's transparent plastic bubble. This meant that when actors were delivering their most important dramatic moments, the scenes that required the most emotional intimacy and subtle facial expressions, they had to perform while essentially nose-to-nose with a massive piece of mechanical equipment that looked more like industrial machinery than a movie camera. The psychological impact of having this enormous, intimidating contraption looming just inches from their faces was so intense that it fundamentally changed how many of the performers approached their craft. Hollywood actors in the early 1960s were trained to use subtle, naturalistic techniques that worked perfectly for regular movie cameras, where they could maintain a comfortable distance from the equipment and focus entirely on their emotional connection to the scene and their fellow actors. But the Cinerama system made this impossible, forcing them to adapt their entire acting style to cope with the mechanical monster breathing down their necks. Many of the actors found the experience so unnerving that they abandoned their usual film acting techniques altogether and instead adopted the much more exaggerated, theatrical style of performance that stage actors use when playing to audiences in large theaters. This shift toward bigger, more dramatic gestures and vocal delivery was a direct response to their discomfort with the intimidating camera setup, and it's one of the reasons why many of the performances in How the West Was Won feel slightly over the top compared to other films from the same era, where actors could rely on their normal, more understated film acting methods. Fact 13. 12. Zero extras and no close-ups. How the West Was Won broke all previous records for the number of background performers used in a single film, employing more than 12,000 extras to fill the massive scope of the Cinerama format. But this impressive number actually highlighted one of the biggest limitations of the revolutionary camera system. The Cinerama process captured such an incredibly wide field of view that traditional close-up shots became nearly impossible to achieve, which meant directors had to completely rethink how they told their story on screen. In regular movies, filmmakers rely heavily on close-up shots to show actors' facial expressions during emotional moments, allowing audiences to connect intimately with characters during their most important scenes. But the Cinerama camera's 146-degree angle of view made these intimate shots extremely difficult to pull off convincingly, since getting close enough to capture facial details would distort the actor's features or create awkward framing that looked unnatural on the massive curved screen. This technical limitation forced the directors to compensate by emphasizing spectacle and grand visual storytelling instead of intimate character development. Rather than focusing on subtle facial expressions or quiet dialogue scenes between two people, they had to fill every shot with sweeping landscapes, massive crowd scenes, and epic action sequences that would take advantage of Cinerama's strengths while hiding its weaknesses. The 12,000 extras became essential to this approach because they helped create the kind of large-scale visual impact that Cinerama was designed to showcase. These background performers filled wagon trains, populated entire frontier towns, formed massive Civil War battle formations, and created the bustling railroad construction camps that gave the film its sense of epic scale and historical authenticity. Director Henry Hathaway later summed up the frustration of working within these constraints by complaining that a waist shot was about as close as you could get with the Cinerama system, meaning that the most emotionally important moments in the film had to be played out at a distance that would normally be reserved for establishing shots in conventional movies. Fact 14. The accidental world premiere location. In one of the most ironic twists in Hollywood history, How the West Was Won, a film that celebrated American frontier spirit and the uniquely American experience of westward expansion, held its world premiere not in New York or Los Angeles, but in London, England, on November 1, 1962. This meant that British audiences got to see this quintessentially American epic before anyone in the United States had a chance to experience it in theaters. The decision to premiere the film in London wasn't based on any particular love for British audiences or desire to honor international markets, but rather came down to practical considerations about where Cinerama theaters were actually operating at the time. The Casino Cinerama Theatre in London was one of the few venues in the world that was properly equipped to show the film in its intended 3-projector format, and the theater operators were eager to secure this major Hollywood production for their grand opening. What nobody expected was just how successful the London run would become. British audiences embraced this American Western epic with remarkable enthusiasm, and the film ended up running at the Casino Cinerama Theatre for an absolutely incredible 123 consecutive weeks. This meant that How the West Was Won played continuously in London for more than 2 years. From its November 1962 premiere all the way through April of 1965, the London premiere generated a $450,000 advance, which was considered enormous for the time period, and the positive reviews from British critics helped build excitement for the film's eventual American release several months later. Variety's London correspondent called it a magnificent and exciting spectacle, while other British reviewers praised the technical achievements of the Cinerama process and the epic scope of the storytelling. The film's unexpected success in London proved that the story of American westward expansion had universal appeal that transcended national boundaries, even when audiences were watching it thousands of miles away from the frontier landscapes it depicted. Fact 15. The missing sheriff's head injury. One of the most puzzling moments in How the West Was Won occurs during the final train robbery sequence, when Sheriff Ramsey, played by Lee J. Cobb, suddenly appears on screen wearing a conspicuous bandage wrapped around his forehead with absolutely no explanation for how he got injured. In one scene, Ramsey is perfectly fine and uninjured, and then in the very next scene, he's sporting this mysterious head bandage, as if something significant had happened to him between shots. This unexplained injury left audiences scratching their heads and wondering what they had missed, because the film provided no context whatsoever for why the sheriff would suddenly need medical attention. The bandage was clearly meant to indicate that Ramsey had been knocked unconscious or injured in some kind of altercation, but viewers were given no information about when, where, or how this supposed incident had occurred. The mystery was solved years later when film historians discovered what had happened during the editing process. There was originally a scene that explained the sheriff's injury, showing George Peppard's character Zeb Rawlings striking Ramsey over the head with his rifle butt when the sheriff tried to prevent him from going after the train robbers. In this deleted scene, Zeb knocks Ramsey unconscious so he can pursue the outlaws without interference from the law, which would have clearly explained the bandage that appears in the following scenes. But for unknown reasons, this crucial scene was either never filmed or was cut from the final version of the movie during editing, leaving behind only the visual evidence of Ramsey's injury without any explanation for how it happened. The missing scene was actually included in the comic book adaptation of the film that was published alongside the movie's release, where readers could see Zeb whacking the sheriff over the head and knocking him out cold. This editing oversight created one of the film's most glaring continuity errors, turning what should have been a logical plot point into a confusing mystery that has puzzled viewers for decades, making it seem as if the sheriff's head injury had materialized out of thin air.